The first sightings of any sort of thoughts that we could describe as anti-Semitism actually rises in ancient Egypt, in 270 BC, with the Egyptian historian Manetho. He described the Jews as lepers and as a polluted people. So if we think about the same kind of language that we see during the Third Reich, we also see this in that 270 BC Egypt, okay? Time and time again, like different cultures that came in contact with Jews had these very negative views of them. So for instance, the Greeks as well, like, they desecrated their temples. So when Alexander the Great conquered that region, they really tried to impose Greek culture onto the Jews and stuff. They tried to ban the practice of circumcision. They tried to get rid of many of their different sacred tenets and stuff. And actually the festival of Hanukkah is about a rebellion against the Maccabees. I think I've got that right. Or is it Yeah, it's against the Maccabees, right? Or are they the Maccabees? I can't remember. Either way, it's about Jews rising up against the imposing influence of the Greeks onto their culture and onto their faith. Part of why Jews kind of stood out, especially in the ancient world, was, if you think about it, all religions since the dawn of time had always been polytheistic, meaning that people worship multiple gods. So there's a god for this and a god for that and a da-da-da-da-da. Judaism was one of the first, and is certainly one of the oldest, monotheistic religions, meaning a belief in just one god, in one deity. When people would conquer different regions, it'd just be a thing of, well, you, the subject people and stuff, you can carry on worshipping your gods, but also we expect you to worship our gods and we'll worship some of your gods and etc. So it ended up being a kind of merging of different religions, and people would be like, oh, okay, cool, we'll just worship those gods as well. The Jews, because they were unshaken in their, we're not worshipping idols, we're not worshipping false gods, we're not even considering doing any of that stuff, right? The Lord, he is the only one, he's the only one we're praying to. The fact that they were completely unwilling to bend for that, and any other part of their culture, any other part of their thing, from circumcision to what food they eat or anything like that, the fact that they were not willing to negotiate or compromise any of that meant that they stood up like a sore thumb. And you see this time and time again throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia, in different cultures, the fact that the Jews stand out like a sore thumb because they are not willing to compromise any part of their religion, in opposition to the people surrounding them. So then after this, you're not having, the Roman Empire becoming the dominant force in the Mediterranean. And of all the peoples that the Romans conquered, the Jews tended to be a constant thorn in their side, again because they weren't willing to compromise. As early as 19 AD, see uprisings against the Romans and then crushings of them. From 66 to 70 AD, we see a massive uprising of the Jews where they try and kick the Romans out, and this leads to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which to this day, the Wailing Wall is the Western Wall, which is the only remaining part of the historic temple and stuff. This is why Jews to this day will still pray at the Wailing Wall, because this is the holiest site in Judaism. So if one ever goes to Israel, one will see just how pivotal Jerusalem is to Jews, right? In 138 AD, the Jews are expelled from Jerusalem itself, and they're banned from practicing their faith. As the centuries go on, they end up being dispersed across the Mediterranean, and this is how the Jews end up forming the different groups of Jews that we think of today. The Sephardim, which are more Mediterranean Jews, the Mizrahim, which are the ones living in the Middle East, the Ashkenazi, who are basically ones living in Northern Europe. We end up seeing these different groups because of this scattering. The Bible even speaks about this in terms of the Jews being scattered to the four corners of the earth. It's amazing to think about it. Of all the different civilizations, of all the different peoples that lived at that time, you had the Phoenicians, you had this, you had that, the Babylonians, 2,000 years later, of all the different groups of people that lived at that time, the Jews are the only people who survived, because what one has to remember is that Judaism isn't merely a religion, it's also a way of life, it's also a culture, it's also an ethnic group, it's a nation within itself, and no matter how far you disperse that nation, they will always have that connection to Israel. The Jews, even though they're scattered across the whole of the Roman Empire and across the whole world, like as time goes on, they still maintain that same identity. 10% of the Roman population were made up of Jews. So even though you had all these forced conversions, you had all these kind of things, right? Especially with the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, when they started like kind of really cracking down on Judaism there, they forced a lot of people to convert and stuff. And it's estimated that if it hadn't been for these forced conversions, during that period, current population of Jews in the world today would be at 200 million. And as it currently stands, it's only at 15 million. So this gives an extent of just how much Jewish culture and Jewish like religion has been suppressed, and especially with the advent of the Crusades and stuff, the myth of them being Christ killers, because obviously they voted basically like to have like Jesus crucified and being a false Messiah. They end up being what we today describe as pogroms. So basically like persecutions, like massacres of Jews. The very famous one of this in 1190 AD, there was a massacre in York of all the Jews. So all the Jews in the town fled up into this little castle, and they end up being like completely wiped out. And events like this took place all across Europe during this time. Country after country then started to expel Jews. So you see this in France, you see this in many of the German states, in many of the Italian states, etc. Even England itself, which we think of today as being like very liberal and very tolerant, actually expelled Jews and banned any Jews from living in England from 1290 up until 1654. That's a huge expanse of time, right? You're talking like over 350 years of Jews being completely banned from the country. It took until Oliver Cromwell, decided to let Jews in, So you're talking about a huge swath of time. This kind of shows just how kind of endemic it was. And actually, here's another statistic, that will blow you away. Because in Europe, the only two places that really tolerated Jews were Holland and Poland. Poland, which at that time was actually interestingly the largest country in Europe in terms of like landmass, Poland had 80% of the world Jews in the 16th century. So talk about 1500s, 80% of world Jewry lived in Poland. That's how persecuted they were in all the rest of the countries in Europe. They were kicked out every other country in Europe, and the only place that they really had to go to, for the most part, was Poland. When we skip forward to the Holocaust and we think, why were there so many Jews living in Poland, like kind of in the Warsaw Ghetto, etc., that's the legacy of that is because Poland for centuries was the only safe place for Jews to live in. But even though Jews like faced a lot of discrimination in this time, and even though plagues were blamed on them, etc., because Jewish like religious practices, like kind of really have really big emphasis on cleanliness. Considering at the time most like Christians like kind of did not have very like good like hygiene, they end up being more prone to disease. So when like things like the Black Death, for instance, spread through Europe, Jewish communities tended to be a lot more immune from it, just because they weren't living in such filthy conditions, right, as the nearby Christians. So this ended up leading to suspicions where they basically said, the Jews are poisoning the wells, they're doing this, they're doing that, etc., right? It's also a time when the myth of like blood libel came about, where it was believed that Jews would like take Christian like children and like slit their throats and like use the blood for their like rituals and so really like ugly stuff. And we see this same mythology, again with the Nazis, like kind of hundreds of years later. The same, there's even like pictures of it and stuff like kind of like in the Nazi newspapers, like the Dispersion, right? A lot of the kind of like deeper mythology of like anti-Semitism like really predates anything that we see in the modern era, right? But even still, Jews challenged like Christians and stuff, right, on an intellectual basis, on a spiritual, the high point of this, is if probably going to butcher the name, but Nachmanides, right? So in the Disputation of Barcelona, in 1263, this Jewish intellectual debated with high up people in the Catholic Church, right? Because they put on this kind of like show kind of debate, and basically were trying to use it as a platform to be able to disprove to the Jews and stuff, but basically saying like, look, the Old Testament predicts Jesus. Clearly, Jesus is the Messiah, whereas obviously Jews believe that he's not the Messiah because he doesn't fit all the criteria, right? Nachmanides, he made the point that, hold on, Christians will point to the prophet Isaiah and to other prophets and stuff and say, look, because Jesus fits some of the criteria in this thing, it clearly is referencing him. Nachmanides took the standard Jewish line, which is that, well, actually, for the Messiah to come, it can't just be some of the prophecies have been fulfilled, all of them have to be fulfilled. So, for instance, it talks about how in the end times, like kind of when the Messiah comes back, the lion will lay down with the lamb, and the sword will be turned into plowshares and stuff. Yeah, i.e., there will be complete peace on the world. You know, Melody said, well, Christ died over 1,200 years ago, and yet there's clearly still war. There's clearly not peace all around the world. But like, never mind all the other kind of like prophecies that attach to it. So it was like, well, clearly then by this internal reasoning, yeah, like Christ cannot be the Messiah, because how else does one explain all these other things, all these other parts of the prophecy not being fulfilled? Christians didn't actually really have much to say against this, and so in later disputations with other Jews as the centuries went on, this debate here, this disputation, was a very rare one, because the person defending the Jewish faith in this instance, was given far more like freedom to speak and to make their arguments, than were later Jews. It was more akin to like a show trial kind of thing, where they weren't actually really able to make what the arguments that they wanted to make. For now, we have to understand that during the time when Spain was run by the Muslims, for a brief golden era, they were freer than they were in many other places in Christian Europe. But this all came to an end in 1492 with the final conclusion of the Reconquista. So with the fall of Granada in 1492, there was an edict that went out that basically expelled all the Jews from Spain. They said you either have to convert or you have to like flee, basically. Many of them who fled ended up going to places like Holland. Many of them went to places in the New World, because 1492 was also the year where Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, right? Even the city of New Amsterdam, which the Dutch founded, which was later taken over by the British and became the famous New York. Sephardi Jews, like who originally were from Spain, went to Holland and then went over there. But even there, they were restricted, right? In North America, all the way up until the American War for Independence, Jews were still denied the right to vote in many of the colonies, right? So even in what we now consider like kind of America, the land of the free, home of the brave, etc., even there, Jews were discriminated against. Right, so now this section here, this is where things start getting very ugly, and we have like a whole bunch of quotes from different people, right? So one would expect with the kind of like so-called Age of Reason and the Age of the Enlightenment, that many of these arguments would die away, but there ended up being a clear argument between, can Jews assimilate? Should they assimilate? Basically, it all comes down to a thing of, during this time, again, because they had more and more concept of scientific racism, of like blood and soil, of all these kind of like concepts, right? It meant that those who made arguments that Jews should have the right to assimilate and ought to assimilate and stuff, end up coming up against people who said, well, no matter what they do, no matter if they convert, no matter what, they are still tainted by Jewish blood. Trigger warnings, we're going to be reading a lot of quotes here, and like some of them will be from quite distinguished people that you like one would not have expected, right? We're going to go country by country now. We're going to start off with Britain, the British Isles in general, right? Just again to get the notion out of one's head that anti-Semitism is just something that came out of Germany, and just read some of the quotes. So this is from Lord Balfour, right? So famous for the Balfour Declaration stuff, which led to the creation of the State of Israel, right? He has no prejudices against the race, far from it. But I began to understand the point of view of those who are opposed to I can't read my own handwriting. To foreign immigration, is the original kind of like, I'm not a racist, but I don't have a problem with Jews, but I can see why people would have a problem with them. This is from James Joyce, right? They do not know how to use the latrine, meaning like the toilet, and they prefer their own semi-barbarous habits. He also referred to many industrialists, Jewish industrialists during this time as the sweaters of modern Israel, right? So all the kind of people owning the factories and everything at the time, he basically was like, oh, well, they're all just Jews, like making Gentiles sweat, basically. Hugh O'Donnell, he spoke about the Jew kings were come, but Parliament of England gone. And talk about the Jew kings of opium, the Jew kings of railways, etc., etc. England being a very class-conscious society in that time, yeah, is a juxtaposition that we see time and time again with like in other contexts as well, yeah, whereby Jews are either seen as dirty or they're seen as kind of they're like super like rich capitalists and stuff, yeah, but they don't really belong in that class. It's kind of a very like snobby kind of like form of racism, right? Now with France, right? So France, different mindset, yeah. Like Napoleon was the one who allowed who emancipated like kind of the Jews and stuff. But the question is to do with like the loyalty to the French nation and stuff, right? The French the French artist Renoir, right? They come to France to make money. The moment a fight is on, they hide behind the first tree. Every country chases them out. There must be a reason for that. This is Juin. I can't pronounce French, as you know, right? They're leper, blood-sucking people. Going to. Bro, I actually should have like focused on my handwriting while writing this. Yeah, going to arise arrogantly like a gigantic boa whose constricting coils are tied round a dying world, squeezing and crushing it. So this idea of Jews basically trying to crush the life out of France and the whole world. And also as well, this was written at the time of the Dufresne affair, which is basically French military court, yeah, like kind of like tried a Jewish officer called Dufresne. It really tore France in half, yeah, because 80% of the press, yeah, were anti this guy. A lot of people in the establishment were completely anti this guy. Like vast waves of the French population believed that he was a German spy because he's a Jew, so his loyalty to France, yeah, like, is very questionable. Now, we're gonna see what it's like in Russia. So if we think about the Holocaust, yeah, like kind of Russia, the Ukraine, Belarus, these kind of places end up being places where a lot of Jews lived because the Tsarist regime banned Jews from living anywhere except for the Pale of Settlement. The Tsarist secret police, they forged this concept called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? Within this theory, it's basically a Jewish plot to take over the world and stuff. And so this idea first arose out of like Russia, right? It was a convenient kind of thing for the Tsarist regime to kind of be like, oh, like don't look at us here, like kind of like look at the Jews and stuff, yeah. And this kind of led to a lot of the pogroms and stuff. And they said that Jews are the root of all evil, the sole cause of our misfortune. So with this, we can see that actually 40 years before the Holocaust, yeah, these same communities out in like the Pale of Settlement, yeah, i.e. the Ukraine, etc., before Babi Yar and like the massacres that took place during the Holocaust, yeah, we can really see quite entrenched within Russian culture and like the other Ukrainian culture, etc. We can see this deep-rooted anti-Semitism. And so to move on to Germany around the same period, we see quotes such as from Theodor Bauerhof: "A Jew can no more be a German than a Persian, Frenchman, New Zealander, or African." Germany during this time has really, its nationalism already at this early stage is very much steeped in this kind of like blood and soil mentality, yeah, which was something which we see really clearly with the Nazis. And yeah, and other quotes such as from von Trischel, "The Jew is our misfortune." So echoing like the same thing that I said like in Russia. Langer, he starts speaking about the Jewish question as early as 1905 in terms of like what to do with the Jews as such. And even Karl Marx himself was of Jewish descent. Secular cult of the Jew is haggling. What is its secular god? Money. Money is the jealous god of Israel. And then like with Wagner, yeah, who's a very influential composer, yeah, who Hitler himself like kind of like looked up to in great regard. Even though he did have Jewish friends himself, yeah, spoke very well. We just see from this quote here: "European culture is a foreign tongue in which the Jew has no part to the evolution. The Jew is a homeless person who has been a cold, nay, a hostile onlooker." Really, this idea of Jews being separate from the Aryan race as such, having no part in European culture, always being a hostile onlooker, this idea of this othering of the Jews, the fact of there's no chance of them assimilating because no matter what they do to assimilate, yeah, they're always going to be this kind of perverse like force within them, right? It's then little wonder how you're having a Holocaust, yeah, when you had views disentrenched across even quite liberal countries like kind of like Britain and stuff. After World War One, you start to see more of this kind of these views become like really entrenched as well, because this idea of Jews on the one hand being capitalists and on the other hand being Bolsheviks, because many of the leading communists in Russia and in Germany and many other places were themselves Jewish. It all ends up becoming intermeshed with this wider conspiracy. And so even groups like that we think of as, like the KKK, for instance, in America, groups that we wouldn't normally associate with anti-Semitism, like we tend to think that in terms of more anti-black discrimination, but like the KKK like discriminate against Jews as well. Within both Europe and America in this time, anti-Semitism is a fundamental belief held by the vast majority of people. But at the same time, the story is not all doom and gloom. So in any country where Jews are able to operate, and able to be themselves essentially without fear of persecution, they flourish. What's quite funny is that Jews for many centuries had been restricted from many professions, right? And one of the few ones that they could operate in was banking, because Christians and Muslims had restrictions on the practice of usury, which is basically lending money for interest, so i.e. modern banking. Jews, because they were exempt from that, if people wanted cheap credit, they would go to Jews for it. And as a result, Jews, just like many other middleman groups around the world, whether it's the Armenians or the Igbos in Nigeria or etc., right? They operate as traders, as entrepreneurs, as innovators and stuff. That added to the fact of them being a highly educated, highly literate population. Themselves being from a very young age being taught to be able to read the Torah, and then for many of them being bilingual, both in their own language and in the language of the wider population around them. Having people who are bilingual and highly educated, at a time when most people around them would have been illiterate peasants, it means that, well, of course, there's going to be a disparity between those who have wealth and those who do not have wealth, because they have all the means to be able to acquire wealth. And if one has a very limited view of economics, a very primitive view on it, where one has zero-sum analysis on it, in the sense of some people, if someone has wealth, then it means that someone else has taken that wealth from someone else. People with that kind of mindset, if they saw wealthy Jews and they saw poor Gentile, the conclusion that they came to is that the Jews must be rich because they've taken money from the Gentiles, when actually that's the complete wrong approach to take to it. Instead of copying the good habits of the Jews, they became envious, they became jealous, and that was a big source of the anti-Semitism and a lot of the pogroms that took place. And we must also bear in mind that anti-Semitism is not just a European phenomenon. Within Islam, you have the concept of dhimmis, right? Dhimmis are people of the book as such, right? So they're monotheistic people, so Jews and Christians, But it's a thing of they have a special tax levied on them to kind of encourage them to convert towards Islam, So if you're having to pay an extra tax for being a Jew or Christian, you may as well just become a Muslim and not have to pay that tax. The discrimination against Jews for most of the period of Islam was never as intense as it was in the Christian world, because there was no equivalent of Christ killers. However, from the 1840s onwards, you did start to have a rise of multiple different kind of reactionary forces that taking place within Islam. So you had an increase in religious fundamentalism, which prior to this you hadn't really had in the Muslim world, and also a rise of Arab nationalism. So for the remaining Jews who lived in the Muslim world, they started to face a lot more discrimination. So in places like Lebanon, places like Palestine, which is now the state of Israel, because there were still some Jews living there, and many other places around the Ottoman Empire, etc. Jews faced pogroms there too. So the reason why I bring this up with regard to the Muslim world is to kind of dispel the notion that hostility amongst Arabs, for instance, towards Jews has come only since the creation of the State of Israel, or since at very earliest the Balfour Declaration of 1920. So in reality, anti-Semitism in the Arab world is at least 100 years, if not more, prior to the creation of the State of Israel, right? With pogroms taking place all across the Muslim world. If that's the case, people saying, the Balfour Declaration, which divided up the State of Israel, which started to separate the mandate of Palestine, between Jews and Arabs, this is the beginning of why they became hostile. But actually what we can see is that, so after after the British take over Palestine, yeah, from the Ottomans, and they create the mandate for Palestine, the Jews who started settling there in the 1920s, yeah, they were just like, they just were living there, they're setting up little communities, etc., etc. And there were riots, there were pogroms, there was all kinds of massacres that took place here. And actually, one of the during the Holocaust, there was actually collaboration with the Nazis. So, for instance, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, there's a famous picture of him with Adolf Hitler. Nazi propaganda kind of spread throughout much of the Middle East, yeah, in terms of the vitriol against Jews and stuff. Because such a fuss kind of bit was being made and stuff, yeah, it meant that actually during the Holocaust, where Jews wanted to flee to Palestine, the British authorities actually banned mass migration to Palestine because they feared the backlash that would happen with the Arabs. So really kind of get this notion out of your head that, oh, the anti-Semitism within the Muslim world it's purely down to the policies of the Israeli government. And to say, no, actually it predates it, much as it does in the rest of the world. Anti-Semitism is not a new phenomenon, so people shouldn't ascribe the current anti-Semitism to just like blame it on Israel, right? Clearly, the hatred is a lot more deep-rooted.